Hi there, or good afternoon. My name is Michael Iwama, and I'm chair and professor of the program of occupational therapy at Augusta University, formerly known as Georgia Regents University, and then before that, widely known as the Medical College of Georgia. It's my pleasure to be able to provide some answers to some questions written by some students, some graduate students in the class of 2017 from Grand Valley State University, which is in the state of Michigan in the United States. And so I'm just giving a shout out right now to Lisa Crow and to Amy Parke and to Jasmine Ward and to Jade Sharrer. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you very much for submitting these really great questions that I'm going to go through and provide some answers right off the top of my head. So I hope that this video goes okay. All right. Um, so the first question is, what spurred your decision to go to Japan to develop an OT program? And can you tell us a little more about your background prior to moving to Japan? Well, let's start off with my background prior to moving to Japan. I was actually born and raised in Japan, in the southernmost part of Japan, in a place called Okinawa. And I was there until my teens, when my family then moved to Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. So my family moved to Canada. But it was not in Canada where I learned how to speak English the way that I can. My parents had the foresight to send me and my two older brothers, I don't have any sisters, um, to an American school in Japan. And so we would speak English, or should I say American, during the day, and then the language in the home would be predominantly Japanese. So uh, my background is that I originate in Japan, and then in my adult life, after qualifying to be an occupational therapist and after practicing for a while and also going to graduate school, I had an opportunity to return back to Japan in the 1990s, and twice actually in my adult life, to be able to go back to Japan and to live there and to work there. The first time I was there in the early 1990s, um, where I had the opportunity to study how Japanese corporations look after their um, employee health. My background in occupational therapy is actually in return to work occupational therapy and ergonomics. And so uh, I had a chance to go back to Japan for a brief time. And when I was back in Japan in the early 1990s, I also worked on the side teaching English. I had another opportunity then to return back to Japan, and that was in the mid 1990s, where I spent almost 8 years, about 7.5 years, in an area of Western Japan called Okayama. And I worked at a university there where I had been recruited to help develop one of the first bachelor's degree programs in occupational therapy in Japan. At the time, there were about 35 or 40 schools of occupational therapy in all of Japan. The population at the time of Japan was about 120 million people. So when you compare that to the size of the United States, I think that you'll probably get a view of um, uh, the percentage, or at least the proportion of occupational school therapy schools in proportion to the population. By the time that I left Japan, there were so many more occupational therapy schools that had been developed, and I believe that today there are more than 180 schools of occupational therapy in Japan. Many of these programs are um, at the university. Some are still located in junior colleges, as well as a few in um, vocational training programs. Now, my background before going to Japan, uh, I guess I missed out a few parts there, but I did attend high school in Vancouver, Canada. And then I went to a place called the University of Victoria, also in the province of British Columbia in Canada, to study for a Bachelor of Science in Human Performance, which now I think is commonly referred to as kinesiology or exercise physiology. And when I graduated from that program, I was looking forward to a career of working with elite athletes on their fitness programs and to look after their rehabilitation concerns, athletic injuries, and so on. And I went through a period of time where I was content, I guess, to help people at normal levels of performance um, try to reach supernormal levels of performance. And I got a little bit tired of that, but not just um, helping people with the physical aspects of performance in daily life. I wanted to work with people in another dimension, in another place, and that would be people at subnormal levels of performance trying to reach some semblance of normalcy. Now, to make a long story short, um, I was accepted into a program of physical therapy, and that was my goal until I saw the light and made a change. Quit that plan to become an occupation, to become a physical therapist, and changed course and entered into the Bachelor of Science program in occupational therapy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Um, Later on, I would go on to do a graduate degree, a Master's of Science in Rehabilitation Science, also at the University of British Columbia. And then since then, I've done doctoral work. I've actually been enrolled in two PhD programs. For most people, people are usually content to do just one, but I'm one of those crazy people that does more than one. So I did my PhD in sociology in the field of international comparative sociology, and I did that at Kibi International University in Japan. And then later on, I would have the opportunity to enter into another doctoral program in medical anthropology at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. So that's a little bit about myself. I practiced in private practice as well as in vocational rehabilitation practice for a number of years, and most of that experience was in Canada. Okay, I think I've answered probably the first question. Let's go on to the second one. Was there a movement of American OTs to Japan to help develop OT education and training programs? Yes, indeed. In fact, occupational therapy was first brought to Japan in the post war years after the Second World War during the brief occupation of Japan by the conquering forces, the United States. And there was also the establishment of military bases on the Japanese mainland. And one of those bases was an Air Force base just outside of Tokyo. And that was actually the site of the very first school of occupational therapy. It's known in Japan as Kiyosei. And I had the pleasure uh, I guess, being at the University of British Columbia studying for an occupational therapy degree. And the director of the school, Dr. Tally Conine, an American, was the founder of the OT school, the first OT school in Japan. On and off, I think the Japanese have imported occupational therapy, and I think that if we were to look at the most influential methods of occupational therapy and of the knowledge, um, the epistemology of OT in Japan, it would mainly be dominated by ideas that have been imported from the Western world and most notably from America. So the American influence is great. There has been great movement of OTs from America to Japan as well as to other areas of Asia. The Japanese have a propensity to learn new methods, new technologies um, from the very best. So whether it's learning how to make cars from the British or to grind lenses for cameras from Germany, um, when it came to know-how in occupational therapy, that came from um, uh, the United States. Okay, the next question, I hope I answered that last question correctly. How did you specifically challenge Japanese OTs to develop culturally relevant practice? Well, I guess I need to tell a little bit of a story of my own experience of going back to Japan. You know, I originated from that part of the world, and when I moved to Canada as a youngster, I acculturated into North American life. In other words, North American life in Vancouver on the west coast of North America became normal for me. So, um, in learning not just language, but also a way of life and the vernacular, um, all of these experiences, I guess, become a kind of lens through which uh, I view the world and understand when something is normal, when something feels normal, when something is remarkable or peculiar. Um, all of these interpretations of what I experience and see in the world is kind of filtered past a constellation of experiences that I've had until that point in my life. So I had acquired all of these new experiences, shared experiences with others in Canada. Therefore, I became acculturated into the culture of Canada and North America and of the English language. That when I went to Japan and experienced a very different culture, a different language, a different pattern of day to day activity, and the meanings associated with those activities, um, I was going through a kind of a reacculturation, or at least a different kind of acculturating experience. So, um, when I went to Japan, my Japanese fellow colleagues were quite elated because they had been wanting so much to emulate American occupational therapy. And at the time, in the 1990s, learning about occupational therapy theory, for example, the model of human occupation and the occupational therapy performance framework. I mean, all of these theoretical frameworks and models that were popular in the English-speaking world of occupational therapy. That's what the Japanese wanted, but they couldn't understand and navigate these imported models very well. And I met a number of Japanese occupational therapists who really beat themselves up over that they found it so difficult, and many would kind of wonder whether there was just even a difference of intelligence level. And of course, that's just ludicrous. There is really no difference in intelligence level. I noticed that there was a problem in my fellow Japanese OT colleagues not being able to understand these imported ideas. And so, therefore, I came to understand that maybe culture was a problem. At the time, as I was acculturating back into Japanese life uh, in a social dimension, I was running into all kinds of problems. I would go to meetings, faculty meetings at the university, and I would be just like that foreigner who just didn't know the unspoken rules about how we should conduct ourselves. And I would be just rushing in and speaking my mind when, in a collectivist culture like Japan that is structured hierarchically, um, there is a set pattern to when people speak and speak in turn. And when they do speak, depending upon their station in the social framework, that will also dictate the level of formal language that they would use. So I was running into all of these conundrums and problems, and not even really cluing into the fact that there was a cultural difference, a kind of a cultural wall that I was running into. And when I began to understand that, I began to understand the cultural wall that Japanese occupational therapists were having to deal with when trying to understand these normal frameworks and approaches and ways of doing occupational therapy in the Western world. So uh, I went about my own kind of experience or experiment of trying to teach people to, first of all, become aware that there is something of a cultural wall, and then to try to find ways to navigate that. And the way to navigate past these cultural walls is actually not to try to understand those materials that were created in a very different cultural sphere of meaning, but rather to re-examine, to reflect, and to, I guess, dig inward to develop new frameworks, new bodies of understanding, new methods, new approaches that actually resonate with and are meaningful to Japanese people. So, I guess the challenge that I've tried to give to Japanese occupational therapists is really to develop new ways to practice, to reinvent occupational therapy practice from its imported form into new forms that are actually effective in solving problems of everyday needs of Japanese people. So that's the challenge right there, is to reconfigure occupational therapy, to reconceptualize it so that it makes sense to Japanese people. Um, just to give you one concrete example of that, in North America, we're so used to home life standing up or sitting down on the sofa. So we walk between pieces of furniture in our own homes. And when something happens to us, a catastrophe of some sort, we have to then resort to ways to be able to cope again with our requirements of daily living. So a large part of that might be to be able to ambulate, to stand and ambulate independently between the chair and the sofa, between the sofa and the bed. Um, uh, Transfer onto the toilet or into the bathtub and out of the bathtub. Well, if we were to just take those methods and uh, call that occupational therapy and apply those methods directly to um, an elderly Japanese couple, for example, or an elderly Japanese person that has encountered a CVA or stroke, um, it would sound kind of ludicrous to be able to, put this person through training of um, transferring from sofa to chair to bathtub to toilet when daily life of this elderly person in their traditional Japanese home might be that um, everybody sits at floor level and that there are no sofas. Um, yes, there may be some chairs in the dining room area, but I don't know whether you've seen the traditional Japanese home, but it's made up of flooring made from rice straw that's called tatami mats. And it's very common for people to be able to get around on the floor on the tatami quite adeptly. And traditional Japanese bathrooms, for example, toilets are such that the toilet is never in the same room as the bath is, because the bath and the shower are associated with cleanliness, and the toilet is associated with the opposite of that, of uncleanliness. And many traditional Japanese toilets are what we call squat style toilets and are not the ones that we're familiar with that are normal to us, where we just sit down on a toilet seat that's elevated off the floor. Okay, so that's just one concrete example, but there are even deeper and more profound differences that are just as difficult, if not harder, to navigate. And one would be the meaning and the importance of the core concept of occupational therapy, which is occupation. And, the concept of occupation as we know it in the culture of occupational therapy, it's all about doing, being, becoming, belonging, and so on and so forth, or, the things that we do actively that affect our sense of well being and health. But when that is being created from a North American experience, then the term occupation is, is interpreted or at least understood from an experience of uh, the independent individual. Have you ever noticed that if you look at diagrams of occupational therapy, the individual or the self is always or rather I should say is often a distinct and separate entity. Um, Sometimes that self is located in the center of that model's universe. Just look at the diagrams and you'll see that. Now, if you go to a place like Japan or spend some time amongst many indigenous peoples of the world or the majority world, you may discover that not everybody grows up with the sense of rugged individualism as being normal. In a collective, or what has been described as a collective oriented Japanese society, um, you'll see that um, uh, that the term occupation, the way that we talk about it in Western occupational therapy, is almost incomprehensible. In fact, um, you know, doing and the value of doing in everyday life is understood or comprehended through the experience of the collective or the group, the social. So I know it's probably hard to get your head around that, but I'll just finish this little portion by saying that the Japanese, still to this day, after more than 50 years of occupational therapy being in Japan, still don't have a word in the Japanese lexicon that captures adequately the meanings that we ascribe to the concept of occupation in the world or in the culture of occupational therapy and occupational science, I should add. Okay? All right, so how do I feel about my ideas? Uh, how do you feel your ideas relate to the global focus in the AOTA Centennial Vision statement? I'm going to just save this question for last. I think that that's quite an interesting one, and I'm going to put that sort of on the back burner and address it last. Maybe the answers that I give to you, um, because I'm being so long-winded and long in my answers, um, may be able to then allow you to answer that question for me. Okay, let's see how it goes. What was OT like in Japan before Kawa using Western practices? Well, I would say this, I would humbly say this, that Japanese occupational therapy has been very much Western oriented, and it still is. If you were to go to any occupational therapy setting in Japan, as if you had just come from outer space and without any kind of sound, if you were to look at what occupational therapists were doing, then you would think, my goodness, that doesn't differ very much from how OTs in America or Canada or Australia or the English speaking OT world would do it. Okay? Um, the cultural differences, though, that exist, that's embedded in this Western occupational therapy, the way that the Japanese have reconciled this to their practice is to reduce it to method, to technique, to recipes, to form. So there's a tendency to emulate that form, which is very medical model oriented still. The Kawa model is just now becoming known in Japan. It's creeping into Japan as people begin to discover that these ideas that resonate naturally with the Japanese people is something that is worth looking at and considering, and also considering then implementing into local practice in Japan. So they're just coming around to that. So I would say that there is no pre and post Kawa model yet because the Kawa model really hasn't arrived in Japan. It's there, it's published, there are a number of papers, but I think that in collectivist societies that are hierarchically structured, change takes time. And that is because the flow of power and knowledge in the Japanese social always sort of starts at the top of the pyramid and filters its way downwards. That's the way that power flows in Japan, as well as the proliferation of new ideas, including new theory in occupational therapy, even the ones that were built in Japan. Okay, how did implementing Kawa change OT practice in Japan and the United States? Well, it hasn't been implemented yet. A lot of people are just discovering it now, but I'm glad to say that when they discover the Kawa model, they're taken by it. They're astonished that it's a model that both therapists and clients can understand readily. So I'm optimistic about the Kawa model in North America, in Japan, and all over the world. It's really catching on in places like the United Kingdom. The Kawa model is taught in more than 500 OT programs around the world, so it is gaining traction and continuing to move along. But what changes when people use a framework like the Kawa model is that now the therapist and the client have a framework of occupational therapy that is truly holistic and one that differs in a significant way from classic occupational therapy theory and models. That is, that the concept of self and the concept of environment are not understood to be two separate entities. No, the self and the environment are, in the Kawa model, understood to be integrated and in one inseparable whole. And these entities come together and are in constant flux, constant change. So When you take an understanding of well-being in everyday life in which the self and the environment are inseparably held together in a dynamic kind of flow or movement, then it makes it possible for us to be able to regard the client and their struggles and their requirements in everyday life in an equally dynamic manner that is very much tied to, intimately tied to context or environment. So if there's one important lesson to learn about the Kawa model and its difference to other frameworks in occupational therapy, it would be um, the fact that the self and the environment are seen as one. The self is always seen in the context of circumstances and the environment, meaning the physical and social environment. These are inseparable. You change the environment and context, it will change the individual. You change the individual and their abilities, it changes that dynamic in how the environment is perceived and how the environment is used or acted upon. Okay? I hope that that's not too difficult in addition to what you've learned about the Kawa model. Um, so, what do you see as the future application of the Kawa? Well, that's partially being answered, even today about how the Kawa model is going. My own wish for the Kawa model, because it presents a truly novel and new way of looking at um, people in the context of their environments with respect to health and well-being, is that it not replace other models of occupational therapy, but rather to be another useful framework or tool that occupational therapists can keep in their bag of useful tools, that it will be um, used predominantly as a main set of lenses through which to view the client and to view the client in totality as integrated with context or environment. So I would want the Kawa model in the future to inform a much more holistic practice and and a practice that really embraces the transactional nature of the self and environment. Um, there are many different groups outside of occupational therapy, classic occupational therapy, that are using the model. And so these groups are, for example, business groups and economy groups that are using the Kawa model, not on individuals, but on collectives. Um, you can just imagine if your business company was like a river, what kinds of rocks stand in the way of its flow? What is the social and physical environment like to enable or to constrain flow? What are your driftwood that come along that can open up new channels of flow or combine with the hard structures to add to and compound the blockage or obstruction to flow? Okay, so um, I've had groups that are into life coaching uh, use the Kawa model and report great results with it. I think that it's just a very versatile model. Um, it's just a metaphor, but it's how people then harness the metaphor and use it in a process to help one another. Theory and models are like maps that we use to help us navigate the way to where we need to go. And I just think that the Kawa model happens to be a particularly good map to be able to have. One that is easy to understand, one that is comprehensive, and really shows in detail the terrain that is going forward. One last thing that I just want to tell you about the Kawa model is this. If you really want to understand the Kawa model, um, here's a take-home message, and I'll just end with this. That is that think about the the client, the patient, being the theorist who develops a model or a piece of theory that explains their experience of day-to-day life. Right? So it's the client who becomes the theorist who makes a model. And each model made by each theorist is unique to their experience of everyday life. Then the therapist becomes a student of the client's or theorist's model, asking questions. What's this rock here? Why are the walls so constrained in this area? What's this piece of driftwood? Why is it there? What is it doing? Okay? And through this dialogue, you are able to better understand that person's theory of daily life or model of daily life. And then you can then put your heads together and look at what kinds of goals you'd like to put forward, what kinds of things you'd like to tackle to enable that person's life to flow better, for their river to flow much more powerfully and beautifully. So much of our theory in occupational therapy has been made from a modernistic or universal way. It's kind of like a one-size-fits-all type of way, and we demonstrate this by taking one model and applying it rigidly, foisting it onto people everywhere in the same way, as if every person's life and view of reality was consistently and universally the same. It's not. Your experience of life and your view of life and truth and reality, it differs. It might be quite similar to the person sitting next to you, but it's not exactly the same. And neither are your clients' narratives or stories of their experience of everyday life. When the client becomes a theorist and builds their model or hypothesis or theory, they are actually um, providing the concepts and the principles that tie the concepts together. When the Kawa model is explained by a client, they're using their own words in their own language, in their own way. And it is really their narrative or their story that is being respected, being put on a pedestal. That's the one that's being privileged. And unless we do that, occupational therapy cannot be a client-centered practice. Okay, I think we're out of time. See if you can answer that last question for me. And if you can't, invite me to come back and just add that little bit to the very end of this. I hope I haven't gone too long. My goodness, it's almost 40 minutes. Well, sorry, I hope this helps, and goodbye for now. Have a great day. Shout out to the class of 2017 of Grand Valley State University in the great state of Michigan. All right, goodbye for now, and I hope your river flows powerfully and beautifully. Thank you very much.